December 15th, 1817. The winter afternoon pressed against the small attic window with all the weight of inevitability, grey and cold as the stone chapel where Eleanor Ashworth had spent the morning in prayer. She sat now in the narrow room that had been hers since childhood, her plain grey wool dress blending into the colourless light, her hands folded in her lap with the disciplined stillness of one who had learned long ago not to take up too much space in the world. Beyond the frost-traced glass, snow had begun to fall in thick, silent flakes, blanketing the Yorkshire countryside in white, and she watched it with the detached observation of someone studying a landscape she would soon leave behind forever. In 3 months, when spring softened the frozen earth, she would depart for the convent in Northumberland, where a small cell and a life of devotion awaited her. It was settled. It had been settled for years, really, since her father had first spoken of her calling to the church, since Lady Catherine had looked at her with those dismissive eyes and said it was the most suitable path for a girl of such limited prospects. Eleanor had accepted it. She had trained herself to accept it, to find peace in the acceptance, to tell herself that a life of prayer and service held its own quiet dignity. She was 24 years old, unmarried, without beauty or fortune or any particular accomplishment that might recommend her to the world beyond these walls. Her younger half-sister Isabella, lovely and vivacious at 19, would make a brilliant match, would have the debut season in London that their father could somehow afford for her, though he could spare nothing for Eleanor's dowry. The contrast between them had been drawn so many times, in so many ways, that Eleanor had learned not to flinch at it any more. Downstairs, she could hear the sounds of the household preparing for evening, the quick light steps that could only be Isabella moving through the hall, Lady Catherine's voice calling sharp instructions to the servants about dinner. Eleanor remained motionless in her attic sanctuary, this small room with its slanted ceiling and single window, the trunk in the corner already half filled with the few plain garments she would take with her to her new life. On the wooden table beside her bed sat her prayer book, the leather worn smooth by her mother's hands before her own, and she reached for it now with fingers that trembled slightly in the cold. She did not open it. Instead, she held it against her chest and closed her eyes, and allowed herself one brief moment of weakness, one small acknowledgement of the worldly longing she had worked so hard to suppress. What might it have been like, she wondered, to be wanted, to be chosen, to be seen as something other than the overlooked daughter, the inconvenient expense, the girl too plain and too poor to matter? Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The dinner table stretched before Eleanor like an instrument of subtle torture, its polished surface reflecting the candlelight and the faces of those gathered around it, a twice-weekly ritual of family unity that fooled no one, least of all herself. She sat at the far end, nearest the shadows where the light did not quite reach, her chair positioned at an angle that seemed to acknowledge her presence, while simultaneously suggesting it was not quite essential to the gathering. Lady Catherine presided over the opposite end with the imperious grace of one who had married into the baronetcy and never let anyone forget the favour she had bestowed by doing so, her throat adorned with the pearl necklace she wore to every formal dinner, each luminous bead a small declaration of her superiority. Isabella sat to her mother's right, positioned in the warmest pool of firelight, her golden curls arranged in artful ringlets that caught the glow and transformed it into something almost celestial, her pale pink muslin dress cut fashionably low at the bodice, in a way that would have earned Eleanor a sharp lecture about modesty, had she ever possessed a gown that fit well enough to attempt such a style. Baron Thomas sat between his wife and daughter, a man diminished somehow by the women flanking him, his shoulders rounded with a weariness that Eleanor had noticed increasing over the past months, his attention fixed on his plate with an intensity that suggested he was trying very hard not to look at anything else. The meal proceeded with mechanical civility. The soup course followed by roasted pheasant, each dish presented by servants who moved through the room like ghosts, their presence acknowledged only when something needed replenishing. Isabella dominated the conversation with breathless accounts of the preparations for her London season, the gowns being made, the influential families who had promised to call, the balls where she would certainly be the most admired girl in attendance, and Lady Catherine encouraged every self-satisfied word with indulgent murmurs and pointed observations about how fortunate it was that at least one daughter had the looks and charm to make an advantageous match. Eleanor ate in silence, her fork moving from plate to mouth with steady precision, her expression carefully neutral, a skill she had perfected over years of such dinners. She had learned long ago that invisibility was easier than opposition, that quiet acceptance drew less cruelty than any attempt at self-assertion. It was Lady Catherine who broke the established rhythm of the meal, setting down her wine-glass with a deliberate clink that commanded attention, her sharp eyes fixing on her husband with an expression that mingled irritation and something that might have been anxiety. "We are to have a visitor tomorrow," she announced, her tone suggesting this was both an imposition and an opportunity. "The Marquess of Winterbourne has sent word that he will call upon us at midday." Isabella's eyes widened with immediate interest, her pretty mouth forming a perfect circle of surprised delight, and she leaned forward eagerly to ask what manner of man he was, whether he was young, whether he was handsome, whether he was rich. Baron Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably and said that the Marquess was a war hero, wounded at Waterloo, a man of considerable property and impeccable lineage who had recently inherited additional estates in Yorkshire and was surveying his holdings. Lady Catherine pursed her lips and added, with a meaningful glance at Isabella, that he was 32 years old, unmarried, and known to be reclusive due to disfiguring scars acquired in battle, but that his wealth and title more than compensated for any physical imperfections. Eleanor felt rather than saw the quick dismissive glance her stepmother cast in her direction, before adding, in a voice edged with contempt, that it was fortunate indeed that some men valued beauty enough to overlook such flaws, just as some women must learn to overlook their own plainness and be grateful for whatever modest future God saw fit to grant them. December 16th, 1817. The morning arrived with the crystalline brilliance that follows a heavy snowfall, the world transformed overnight into something both beautiful and harsh, the sun striking the white landscape with an intensity that made Eleanor squint as she moved through the ground-floor rooms of Ashworth Manor, helping the servants prepare for the arrival of their distinguished guest. She wore her dark blue work dress, the practical wool faded from years of wear, a white apron tied around her waist, and she carried herself with the quiet efficiency of one accustomed to making herself useful without expecting recognition for it. The household had been in a state of controlled chaos since dawn, Lady Catherine issuing orders with the sharp precision of a general marshalling troops, Isabella locked away with her lady's maid, arranging her hair and selecting her finest morning dress, Baron Thomas pacing in his study with the restless energy of a man whose anxiety had moved beyond concealment into visible agitation. Eleanor had retreated into the familiar refuge of productivity, polishing silver that did not truly need polishing, arranging flowers in the entrance hall, checking that the drawing-room fire burned hot enough to chase away the winter chill. She told herself she felt nothing about this visitor, that her curiosity was merely the natural interest anyone might have in a nobleman of such reputation, that the strange flutter in her chest when she thought of his impending arrival was simple nervousness about disruption to routine rather than anything more dangerous. It was precisely 10 o'clock when the sound of hooves on the snow-packed drive drew everyone's attention, and Eleanor found herself moving toward the front windows despite her intention to remain in the background, her breath catching as she glimpsed the rider approaching through the brilliant morning light. He sat astride a magnificent black stallion, the animal's coat gleaming like polished obsidian against the white landscape. And the man himself was dressed in a traveling coat of deepest black with silver fastenings that caught the sun as he moved, his posture in the saddle both commanding and utterly at ease with the powerful creature beneath him. He dismounted with fluid grace as a groom rushed forward to take the horse's reins, and Eleanor watched from her position, half hidden behind the heavy curtains, as Alexander Ravenscroft, Marquess of Winterbourne, removed his leather gloves with deliberate slowness, revealing strong hands marked by thin white scars that suggested a history of violence survived. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face turned slightly away from her vantage point, and then he looked up toward the house as if sensing observation, and Eleanor saw in full daylight what the gossips had spoken of in whispers. The left side of his face and neck bore the unmistakable marks of severe burns, the scarring pulling slightly at his jaw and disappearing beneath his cravat, the skin there darker and textured in a way that spoke of extraordinary pain endured. But it was not the scars that held her frozen at the window, breath suspended in her chest. It was his eyes, pale and piercing even from this distance, that seemed to look directly through glass and curtain, and the careful armor of invisibility she had constructed around herself. And in that brief, unguarded moment before she stepped back into shadow, Eleanor felt the disconcerting sensation of being truly seen for the first time in her adult life. The drawing room at Ashworth Manor felt smaller than it had any right to be at 2 o'clock that afternoon, the pale winter sunlight filtering through tall windows and illuminating the faded green wallpaper with its pattern of climbing vines, the warmth from the crackling fireplace doing little to dispel the tension that seemed to thicken the air as Eleanor moved with careful precision to pour tea for their distinguished guest. She had changed from her work dress into something marginally more presentable, a simple grey muslin that had been made over twice and still hung loosely on her slender frame, and she kept her eyes lowered as she performed the ritual of hostess duties that Lady Catherine had thrust upon her with a dismissive wave, clearly deeming Isabella too valuable to waste on such menial service. Alexander Ravenscroft sat in the chair nearest the fire, his posture relaxed yet somehow commanding attention, the scarred side of his face turned partially toward the flames in a way that might have been deliberate or might have been unconscious habit, and Eleanor found her hands trembling ever so slightly as she lifted the delicate porcelain teapot, acutely aware of his presence in a way that made her movements feel clumsy and overly considered. Isabella had positioned herself on the settee directly in his line of sight, her pink silk dress spread artfully around her, the color bringing out the roses in her cheeks and the gold in her carefully arranged curls, and she leaned forward with practiced grace to offer observations about the weather, the upcoming Christmas celebrations, the beauty of his estate, as she had heard it described, each comment delivered with the calculated charm of a girl who had been trained from birth to attract masculine attention. Lady Catherine sat beside her daughter like a general surveying a battlefield, her sharp eyes moving between Isabella and the Marquess with an intensity that suggested she was already counting wedding settlements in her mind, and Baron Thomas hovered near the window with the uncomfortable air of a man who desperately wished to be anywhere else. Eleanor approached Alexander with the first cup of tea, her movements careful and unobtrusive, intending to hand it to him and retreat back into invisibility as quickly as possible, but his pale eyes lifted to meet hers as she extended the cup, and instead of simply taking it, he spoke directly to her in a voice that was lower and rougher than she had expected, asking whether she took sugar in her own tea. The question was so unexpected, so utterly ordinary and yet so shocking in its direct address, that Eleanor nearly fumbled the saucer, catching it just in time and feeling heat rise in her cheeks as she stammered that she did not typically take tea with the family, that she had merely been serving. He continued to hold her gaze with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet somehow prevented her from doing so, and he said that seemed a curious arrangement. Surely the Baron's daughter should be seated with her family, rather than acting as servant. Lady Catherine's voice cut through the moment with the sharpness of breaking glass, explaining with honeyed condescension that dear Eleanor preferred to make herself useful, that she had always been of a more practical and modest disposition than her sister, quite suited to a life of service and prayer. Alexander's expression did not change except for the faintest tightening around his eyes, and he turned that unsettling pale gaze on Lady Catherine with a directness that made her falter mid-sentence, stating with perfect courtesy and absolute finality that he would very much like to hear Miss Eleanor Ashworth's perspective on the history of the region, as he understood there had been a monastery on his newly acquired property in medieval times, and perhaps she, with her religious inclinations, might know something of its history. December 17th, 1817. The chapel at Ashworth Manor stood separate from the main house, a small stone structure that dated back 200 years and held the chill of centuries in its walls, and Eleanor knelt on the cold floor before the simple altar at 9 o'clock in the morning, her breath visible in the frigid air as pale winter sunlight streamed through the single stained glass window, depicting the Virgin Mary in robes of blue and gold, casting patterns of colored light across the worn wooden pews and the flagstones beneath her knees. She held her mother's prayer book in her hands, the leather cover soft and creased from years of use, the pages marked with pressed flowers and handwritten notes in a feminine script that had gone silent 16 years ago when fever had taken Lady Margaret Ashworth and left her daughter orphaned in all but name. Eleanor had come to the chapel seeking the peace she had always found in this quiet space, the sense of purpose and certainty that prayer had given her when the world beyond these walls offered only dismissal and diminishment. But this morning her thoughts refused to settle into their familiar patterns of devotion and resignation, her mind returning again and again to yesterday's conversation in the drawing-room and the unsettling intensity of pale eyes that had looked at her as though she were someone worth seeing. She told herself it meant nothing, that the Marquess had simply been making polite conversation, that his attention had been the courtesy of a well-bred gentleman rather than genuine interest. But even as she formed these rational explanations, she felt the falseness of them, the way they failed to account for the directness of his gaze, or the deliberate nature of his questions, or the strange flutter in her chest when he had spoken her name. This was dangerous territory, she knew. This tentative hope that whispered she might be something other than the plain, unmarriageable daughter destined for a convent cell, and she pressed her forehead against her clasped hands and prayed for strength against temptation, for acceptance of God's plan for her life, for the ability to surrender these foolish worldly thoughts that had no place in the heart of a woman sworn to the church. Except she had never actually sworn anything. Had she? A small rebellious voice whispered in the back of her mind. It had been her father who decided her fate, her father who pronounced her calling, her father who made arrangements with the convent for her admission this coming spring. And she had accepted it with the weary resignation of someone who had learned not to hope for alternatives, because hope only made the disappointment more painful when it inevitably arrived. The colored light from the stained glass window shifted as clouds moved across the sun, and Eleanor opened her eyes to find the chapel dimmer than before, the blue and gold patterns fading from the floor, and it was then that she saw the shadow that fell across the threshold from the open doorway. The dark silhouette of a tall figure standing motionless in the entrance, and she turned her head to see Alexander Ravenscroft watching her with an expression she could not read, his hat in his hands and the scarred side of his face fully visible in the cold morning light. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she rose quickly from her kneeling position. The prayer book clutched against her chest like a shield, her heart suddenly beating with an uncomfortable rapidity that she told herself was merely surprise at being discovered in what she had thought was a private moment of devotion, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks as Alexander Ravenscroft stepped fully into the chapel, his footsteps echoing softly on the ancient stones as he removed his hat with slow deliberation, the gesture revealing the full extent of the scarring that ran from his left jaw down the side of his neck in a pattern of puckered skin that spoke of terrible heat and terrible pain. The cold air in the chapel made their breath visible in small clouds, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away from his face, even as every rule of polite society screamed that she should avert her eyes from his disfigurement. But there was something in his expression that held her attention, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with the intimidating figure he had cut in the drawing room yesterday. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had yet heard it, asking if he was intruding and whether she would prefer that he leave her to her prayers. She shook her head before she could think better of it, surprised to find that despite her embarrassment at being observed in such an intimate spiritual moment, she did not actually wish him to go, and she said in a voice that trembled only slightly that the chapel belonged to God, and all who sought him were welcome within its walls, the formal phrasing coming automatically from years of religious instruction, even as her mind raced to understand why this man affected her so strangely. Alexander moved down the center aisle between the simple wooden pews, and to her astonishment, he did not stop at a respectful distance, but instead sat down in the pew directly beside where she still stood, his pale eyes lifting to the stained glass window with its image of the Virgin in blue and gold, before returning to her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he were reading something written there that she herself could not see. He asked her then whether she had always known she would take holy orders, whether the calling to religious life had come to her as a moment of divine clarity, or as a gradual certainty that grew over time. And there was something in the way he phrased the question that suggested he was asking about more than simple curiosity, some deeper inquiry into the nature of faith and purpose that made Eleanor sink slowly back down onto the cold stone beside the pew where he sat. She found herself answering with more honesty than she had intended, explaining that her path had been laid out for her by others, but that she had tried to find peace in accepting it as God's will. And even as she spoke the words, she heard how hollow they sounded, how much they revealed about resignation rather than genuine calling, and she saw understanding flash in his eyes before he looked away toward the altar. The silence between them stretched out like the colored light from the window, and then Alexander spoke again in a voice so low she had to lean slightly forward to hear him clearly, asking whether she believed redemption was truly possible for those who had done terrible things in war, for those whose hands were stained with blood and whose faces bore the marks of violence, whether God's mercy extended even to men who had become monsters in the service of their country, and Eleanor felt her heart contract with sudden compassion for the pain she heard beneath his carefully controlled tone. December 18th, 1817. The evening air hung heavy with the mingled scents of beeswax candles and hothouse flowers as Eleanor stood in the drawing room at Ashworth Manor at 7 o'clock, acutely aware that she wore one of Isabella's cast-off gowns, a pale yellow silk that had been altered hastily to fit her smaller frame, but still hung oddly at the shoulders and gaped slightly at the waist, making her feel like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. Lady Catherine had insisted she make herself presentable for the dinner party, a small gathering of local families who had been invited ostensibly to welcome the Marquess of Winterbourne to the neighborhood, though Eleanor suspected the true purpose was to parade Isabella before him like a prize mare at market, and indeed her half-sister looked radiant in pink silk with seed pearls sewn into the bodice, her golden curls arranged in an elaborate style that had taken her maid 2 hours to achieve. The guests had begun arriving as twilight faded into full darkness, and Eleanor had positioned herself in her customary place near the window where the heavy green velvet curtains created a shadowed alcove that allowed her to observe without being observed. But tonight, that refuge offered no comfort, because Alexander Ravenscroft had arrived precisely at 7 o'clock in formal evening wear of black superfine with a silver brocade waistcoat, and his pale eyes had found her immediately across the crowded room with an intensity that made her breath catch painfully in her chest. She had tried to avoid his gaze, focusing instead on the other guests, noting the presence of Lord George Pembroke, who carried himself with an easy charm that contrasted sharply with Alexander's rigid formality, and Reverend William Langley, whose round face and thinning hair made him appear older than his 40 years, and the Hartley family with their 3 unmarried daughters who whispered behind their fans, and the elderly Thorntons who owned the estate bordering Ashworth Land. Eleanor could hear the whispers that followed Alexander's passage through the room, the barely concealed speculation about the scarred Marquess and what business had brought him to Yorkshire, and she felt her hands clench into fists at her sides when Mrs. Hartley murmured to her eldest daughter, in a voice clearly intended to be overheard, that it was a shame such a fine title and fortune should be attached to such an unfortunate countenance. Isabella had attached herself to Alexander's arm within moments of his arrival, her practiced smile and fluttering eyelashes on full display as she guided him toward the fireplace where Lady Catherine held court. But Eleanor watched with a strange mixture of satisfaction and confusion as Alexander extricated himself with cold politeness after barely 2 minutes of Isabella's chatter, his attention returning repeatedly to the shadowed alcove where Eleanor stood. The dinner itself had been an exercise in social torture, with Eleanor seated at the far end of the long mahogany table between the deaf Mr. Thornton and the youngest Hartley girl who talked incessantly about her watercolours, while Alexander sat near the centre beside Isabella, who leaned close to him at every opportunity, her décolletage prominently displayed and her laugh artificially bright. But Eleanor noticed that Alexander barely touched his food and responded to Isabella's overtures with monosyllabic replies, and twice she caught him looking down the length of the table toward her with an expression she could not interpret, something darker and more intense than simple courtesy would warrant. When the meal finally ended and the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room while the gentlemen remained behind for port and cigars, Eleanor felt the weight of judgment settle more heavily upon her shoulders as Mrs. Hartley remarked in a carrying voice that it was curious how the Marquess seemed so distracted this evening, and Lady Catherine responded with brittle sweetness that perhaps he was simply overwhelmed by the beauty of Yorkshire ladies, her hand resting possessively on Isabella's shoulder. Reverend Langley had cornered Eleanor near the pianoforte when the gentleman rejoined them, his expression grave and faintly reproachful as he reminded her in low tones that Easter would arrive in just 4 months and the arrangements with the convent had been finalized, and surely she had not forgotten her sacred calling in the midst of worldly entertainments, and Eleanor had felt her throat tighten with something that might have been anger or grief or simply exhaustion at pretending that any choice in her life had ever truly been her own. The last guests had finally departed at 9:30 o'clock, their carriages crunching through the frozen gravel drive as Eleanor retreated upstairs to her small attic room, her head aching from the strain of smiling politely, while whispers circulated about the scarred Marquess and his peculiar interest in the least remarkable member of the Ashworth family. But she had barely removed Isabella's ill-fitting yellow gown when a housemaid knocked timidly to inform her that the Baron requested her presence in his study immediately, and Eleanor felt a cold dread settle in her stomach as she pulled on her plain grey dress and made her way down the narrow servants' staircase to the ground floor where her father's private study occupied a corner room overlooking the winter-dead garden. She found Baron Thomas Ashworth seated behind his massive mahogany desk, his greying hair dishevelled as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, and the surface before him was covered with ledgers whose columns of numbers seemed to mock him with their relentless arithmetic of debt, while Alexander Ravenscroft stood near the window with his back partially turned, his tall figure silhouetted against the darkness beyond the glass, and the fire in the hearth had burned down to sullen embers that cast more shadow than light across the book-lined walls. Her father gestured for her to sit in the worn leather chair opposite his desk, but Eleanor remained standing, some instinct warning her that she would need all her dignity for whatever revelation was about to shatter the fragile peace she had constructed around her predetermined future. And when Baron Thomas finally spoke, his voice cracked with shame as he said he had something of grave importance to discuss regarding her circumstances and the family's situation, though he could not seem to meet her eyes as the words stumbled from his lips. Alexander turned from the window then, his scarred face impassive, but his pale eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her breath catch, and her father began to explain in halting sentences about debts that had accumulated over years of poor investments and gambling losses, about creditors who were demanding payment, about the sum of £15,000 that hung over the family like an executioner's blade, and Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly as she understood that Isabella's expensive season in London and the elaborate gowns and the music masters had all been purchased with borrowed money that could never be repaid. The Baron's hands shook as he reached for the crystal brandy decanter, pouring himself a generous measure with the desperation of a man seeking temporary oblivion. And then he said the words that would change everything, explaining that Lord Ravenscroft had made an extraordinarily generous offer to clear all the family debts and provide an additional settlement in exchange for Eleanor's hand in marriage, and the casual way he phrased it, as though discussing the sale of a horse or a parcel of land, made bile rise in her throat, even as her mind struggled to comprehend that the man who had asked her about redemption in the chapel, who had looked at her as though she mattered, had apparently been calculating her worth in pounds and shillings all along. Alexander spoke then for the first time since she had entered the study, his voice low and controlled, as he stated that he understood this was highly irregular, but that he had been most impressed by Miss Ashworth's character and intelligence during his brief acquaintance with the family, and he wished to make clear that this was a proposal of marriage in the traditional sense, not some sordid transaction, though Eleanor heard the words as if from a great distance, filtered through the roaring in her ears and the sudden understanding that even her exile to the convent had been predicated on money, on her father's inability to provide the dowry that might have secured her a normal life. The Baron produced a document from his desk drawer, a contract written in Alexander's bold hand that outlined the financial arrangements with painful precision, and he said weakly that, of course, Eleanor must have time to consider such a momentous decision, though his eyes pleaded with her to understand that the alternative was ruin for the entire family, the loss of their home, Isabella's prospects destroyed. And Eleanor felt a laugh bubble up in her chest at the bitter irony that she who had been told her entire adult life that she had no value in the marriage market was now suddenly precious because a scarred recluse was willing to pay a fortune for the privilege of making her his wife. The afternoon of December 19th, 1817 arrived cold and colourless, the winter sun struggling to penetrate the thick clouds that pressed down upon Ashworth Manor like a physical weight, and Eleanor sat alone in her small attic room at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, while her father stood near the narrow doorway with his shoulders hunched in an attitude of profound defeat. Having just finished explaining the arrangement he had made with Alexander Ravenscroft, and waiting now for her response with the desperate hope of a condemned man seeking reprieve. The small trunk that sat at the foot of her narrow bed was half packed with the plain garments she had been preparing for her Easter departure to the convent, simple shifts and stockings, and the coarse woolen habits that would become her daily uniform in her new life of devotion, all purchased by her father over the past 6 months as part of what she had believed was her sacred calling. And Eleanor felt a strange numbness spreading through her chest. As she stared at those folded garments and understood with sudden, devastating clarity that none of it had been real, that the vocation she had spent 2 years convincing herself to embrace had been nothing more than her father's convenient solution to his inability to provide her with a dowry. Baron Thomas was speaking again, his voice thin and pleading as he tried to explain how he had never intended for things to become so desperate, how the investments had seemed sound and the card games merely entertainment until suddenly the debts had multiplied beyond his capacity to manage, and he kept insisting that he had truly believed Eleanor possessed a genuine calling to religious life, that he had convinced himself he was honoring her piety rather than simply disposing of an unwanted daughter in the most economical manner possible. But Eleanor heard the hollowness in his words and knew they were the justifications of a weak man seeking to absolve himself of guilt. The simple religious texts that lined the small shelf beside her bed seemed to mock her now with their leather spines and gilt lettering, devotional works on prayer and contemplation and the lives of saints. All gifts from her father presented with solemn pronouncements about her spiritual journey, and she wanted to laugh at her own foolishness for believing that anyone in this house had ever cared about her soul when they could barely acknowledge her existence at the dinner table. Her mother's miniature portrait sat on the windowsill where she had placed it that morning during her prayers, the delicate oval frame containing the only image she possessed of the woman who had died bringing her into the world, and Eleanor found herself staring at that painted face with its gentle eyes and soft smile, wondering if her mother would have fought for her to have real choices, real chances at happiness, or if she too would have considered Eleanor's plain face and unremarkable person as justification for shipping her off to spend her life behind convent walls. The winter light was already fading at this early hour, the short December day dying before it had truly begun, and Eleanor watched her breath mist in the cold air of the unheated attic room as her father continued his pathetic explanations, telling her that of course the decision must be hers, that he would never force her into marriage against her will, though they both knew that refusing Alexander's offer meant destroying not only her own future, but Isabella's as well, condemning the entire family to ruin and disgrace, and the bitterness of having no real choice in either direction, of being equally trapped whether she entered the convent or accepted the Marquess's proposal, made Eleanor's throat tighten with unshed tears that she refused to let fall in front of the man who had betrayed her so completely. She finally spoke, her voice emerging flat and cold in the dimness of the small room, asking her father directly whether she had ever truly had a vocation, or whether he had simply planted the idea in her impressionable young mind after her stepmother made it clear that no effort would be wasted on securing Eleanor a proper debut or suitable match. And Baron Thomas flinched at the question, but could not seem to formulate a coherent answer, his silence confirming what Eleanor had already known in her heart. The small attic window behind her showed the grey winter sky and the bare branches of the oak tree that grew close to the house, and somewhere outside a bird called out in the gathering dusk, its cry sharp and lonely in the frozen air, while inside the cold room Eleanor felt something fundamental shift within her, a recognition that she had spent 24 years trying to make herself small and acceptable and grateful for whatever scraps of belonging might be thrown her way, and that perhaps being sold to a scarred recluse for £15,000 was no worse than being disposed of to a convent to save the cost of a dowry. And at least with the Marquess, there existed the faint possibility that she might be seen, might be valued as something more than an inconvenient obligation to be managed as cheaply as possible. The morning of December 20th, 1817, arrived with pale winter sunlight struggling through heavy clouds, and at 11 o'clock, Eleanor descended the main staircase of Ashworth Manor with her spine rigid and her hands clasped tightly at her waist, having been summoned to the library by a terse note delivered to her attic room an hour earlier, informing her that Lord Ravenscroft wished to speak with her privately regarding the arrangement, and she had dressed with deliberate care in her most severe grey wool gown, as though arming herself for battle, her hair pulled back so tightly that it made her temples ache. She found Alexander standing near the tall windows that overlooked the frost-covered garden, his dark figure silhouetted against the weak morning light, and the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound volumes seemed to close around her like a trap as she stepped across the threshold and positioned herself near the door with her back straight and her chin lifted in unconscious defiance, refusing to approach closer or to take the chair. He gestured toward, with a careful movement of his scarred hand. He studied her for a long moment with those pale eyes that seemed to see too much, and Eleanor felt her armor of cold dignity threaten to crack under the weight of his steady regard. But she forced herself to meet his gaze directly as she said in a voice she barely recognized as her own that she understood the financial arrangement he had made with her father, and that she supposed they should discuss the practical details of when he wished the marriage to take place, since clearly time was of the essence given the urgency of the Baron's debts. Alexander flinched slightly at her tone, and something that might have been pain flickered across his scarred features before he mastered his expression, and replied quietly that he believed her father had perhaps explained the situation poorly, and that he hoped she might allow him to clarify his intentions before she formed her final judgment of his character or his motives. Eleanor remained standing near the door, with her hands now clenched in the folds of her grey skirt, and she felt a bitter laugh threatening to escape her throat as she asked with false sweetness whether there was some way to prettily phrase the purchase of an unwanted daughter, some elegant terminology that might make the transaction less sordid, and she saw Alexander's jaw tighten as he moved away from the window and walked slowly across the library toward the large mahogany table that dominated the center of the room, maintaining a careful distance between them that suggested he understood her need for defensive space. He told her then, with surprising gentleness, that he had indeed offered to resolve her father's financial difficulties in exchange for permission to court her, but that he wished to make absolutely clear that he was proposing a genuine marriage based on mutual respect and companionship, not some cruel arrangement where she would be bound against her will to a man she despised, and that if she would permit it, he would like to suggest terms that might give her both time and agency in making her decision. Eleanor felt her breath catch at the unexpected word agency, and she watched with wary confusion as Alexander picked up a document from the table, a single sheet of paper covered with his bold handwriting, and explained in that low, controlled voice that he was proposing a courtship period of 6 months during which they would come to know each other properly, at the end of which time she would be free to refuse the marriage without any penalty or consequences to her family's finances, and that he would put this agreement in writing with his solicitor as witness so that she need not fear being trapped by false promises or social pressure into a union she found intolerable. The library was very quiet except for the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece and the distant sound of servants moving through the house, and Eleanor stared at the document Alexander held toward her as though it might be some clever trick, some new form of manipulation disguised as generosity. But when she finally forced herself to look up at his face, she saw something there that made her careful anger falter, a loneliness and uncertainty that mirrored her own desperate isolation. And she understood with sudden startling clarity that perhaps she was not the only person in this room who felt like an unwanted thing being bartered in a marketplace of other people's needs. The afternoon of December 25th, 1817 arrived with the clear, bright coldness that only Christmas Day seemed to possess, and a tuckle-tutut clock Eleanor sat in the fourth pew from the front of St. Michael's Church, wearing her best gown of dark green wool with its modest neckline and long sleeves, the fabric carefully brushed that morning to remove any trace of dust or wear, and she kept her gloved hands folded in her lap as she listened to Reverend William Langley deliver his sermon about duty and sacrifice with pointed glances in her direction that made her cheeks burn with uncomfortable awareness of his disapproval. The small stone church was decorated with boughs of holly tied with red ribbons, and dozens of candles flickered in the dim winter light that filtered through the narrow windows, casting dancing shadows across the whitewashed walls and the brass memorial plaques that commemorated 200 years of local families, and the scent of pine and beeswax mingled with the cold stone smell that no amount of candlelight could quite dispel. Eleanor had not expected Alexander to attend the Christmas service, had assumed that a man of his reclusive temperament would avoid the curious stares and whispered commentary that his presence inevitably provoked. But when she had arrived with her family at 1:30, she had seen him already seated near the back of the church, with his dark coat buttoned high and his scarred face turned deliberately toward the wall in an attitude that suggested both defiance and deep discomfort, and her heart had performed an unexpected motion in her chest at this evidence that he had come despite his obvious reluctance, had subjected himself to the judgment of strangers for reasons she did not yet dare to examine too closely. The congregation sang, "God rest ye merry gentlemen," with varying degrees of enthusiasm and skill, and Eleanor found herself listening for Alexander's voice among the others, though she could not have said what she hoped to hear or why it mattered. And when the service finally concluded after 90 minutes of prayers and carols and Reverend Langley's increasingly pointed remarks about young women who forgot their proper place and calling, she stood with the rest of the parishioners and moved slowly toward the door where the vicar waited to offer his Christmas blessings with a stern expression that promised future lectures about her change of circumstances. Alexander was waiting outside near the lich gate when she emerged into the brittle sunlight, and she saw that Lord George Pembroke stood beside him, engaged in quiet conversation. A tall, fair-haired man with an open, friendly face, who smiled at her approach with genuine warmth and none of the calculating assessment she had learned to expect from strangers. And when Alexander introduced his oldest friend with careful formality, Eleanor understood that this presentation carried significance, that she was being offered acceptance into the small circle of people Alexander trusted enough to let past his defensive walls. Lord Pembroke bowed over her hand and told her with evident sincerity that Alexander had spoken of her with great respect, and she felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen at this unexpected evidence that perhaps she was not simply a convenient solution to her father's debts, but rather someone Alexander had discussed with his confidants as a person of actual worth and interest. Alexander drew a small wrapped package from his coat pocket as they stood in the churchyard, with other families milling about, exchanging Christmas greetings and eyeing the scarred Marquess with poorly concealed curiosity. And when Eleanor unwrapped the brown paper with fingers that trembled slightly from cold and nervousness, she found a slim volume of poetry by William Cowper, the pages already showing signs of wear that suggested this was Alexander's own copy rather than something purchased specifically as a gift. And when she opened the front cover, she saw his name written in bold script on the flyleaf, along with a date from 1808. And she understood that he was giving her something personal and valued rather than simply fulfilling a social obligation. She had brought her own gift in the small reticule that hung from her wrist, a handkerchief she had embroidered during the 5 days since their library meeting with a pattern of winter flowers in silver thread, the work occupying her restless hands during long evening hours when she sat alone in her attic room, trying to understand what path she was now walking and whether she possessed the courage to see it through to whatever destination awaited. And when she offered it to Alexander, she saw something shift in his expression, a softening of the harsh lines around his mouth, and a brightness in his pale eyes that might have been pleasure, or might have been something deeper that she did not yet know how to name. The afternoon of January 8th, 1818, arrived with the pale, cold sunlight that turned the frozen landscape into something crystalline and almost otherworldly, and at 2 o'clock, Eleanor walked beside Alexander along the carefully maintained paths of the Ravenscroft estate, with her hand resting lightly on his arm and her brown wool cloak wrapped closely around her, against the bitter wind that swept across the grounds from the north, carrying with it the scent of snow and ice and the distant wood smoke from the estate cottages scattered throughout the property. The winter landscape stretched around them in stark beauty, with the frozen lake gleaming like polished silver in the weak sunshine, and the bare trees standing like dark sentinels against the white hills that rolled away toward the horizon. And Eleanor found herself increasingly comfortable in the silence that had settled between them, no longer feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation or carefully constructed pleasantries that masked genuine thought and feeling. Alexander walked with a slight limp that she had noticed before but never mentioned, his great coat hanging perfectly from his broad shoulders and his walking stick tapping a steady rhythm against the frozen ground. And when they reached the stone bridge that arched over the frozen stream, he paused and looked down at the ice-locked water with an expression that suggested he was seeing something other than the present scene, something from memory that still held power over his thoughts. Eleanor waited with the patience she had learned during 2 weeks of carefully navigating the courtship that still felt both real and impossible. And after a long moment, Alexander began to speak in a low, controlled voice about the Battle of Waterloo, where he had served as a captain in the cavalry, about the chaos and terror of that June day in 1815, when the fate of Europe had hung in the balance, and thousands of men had died in the mud and smoke and confusion of combat. He told her about the night after the battle when the wounded lay scattered across the field crying for water and help, and how he had heard screaming from a burning supply tent and had run toward it without thinking to find a young lieutenant trapped beneath a fallen beam with flames spreading rapidly through the canvas and wooden supports. Eleanor felt her throat tighten as Alexander described pulling the man free and dragging him away from the inferno, and how a burning section of tent had collapsed across his own back and side before he could escape, the fire catching in his uniform jacket and burning through to the skin beneath, while he rolled on the ground trying to extinguish the flames that seemed determined to consume him. The servant, following at a discreet distance of 20 paces, maintained his position as propriety demanded, but Eleanor was conscious only of Alexander's scarred profile as he stared down at the frozen stream and finished his story by saying that the lieutenant had survived and gone home to his family in Scotland, but that Alexander himself had spent 3 months recovering in a field hospital before being sent back to England with scars that ensured he would never forget the price of that single moment of instinctive courage. She stood very still on the stone bridge with the cold wind pulling at her cloak and the winter sun creating long shadows across the frozen landscape, and then with deliberate gentleness she reached out and placed her gloved hand over his scarred one, where it rested on the walking stick. Holding it there, as she told him quietly that she believed true courage was revealed not in the absence of fear, but in acting despite it, and that his scars were not marks of disfigurement, but rather evidence of the most profound kind of honor, the willingness to sacrifice oneself for another human life. The evening of January 20th, 1818 arrived with the heavy grey twilight of winter settling over Ashworth Hall by 6 o'clock. And Eleanor stood in the drawing-room feeling the familiar oppression of the green wall-papered walls closing around her as Lady Catherine paced back and forth before the fireplace with her face flushed and her voice rising to the shrill pitch that Eleanor had learned to recognize as the prelude to particular cruelty, while Isabella sat on the settee in her new red silk dress with her pretty face twisted into an expression of vindictive satisfaction that made her beauty seem suddenly ugly and mean. The confrontation had begun innocuously enough, with Lady Catherine remarking that the Marquess of Winterbourne had been seen riding past the house 3 times in the past week. But the comment had quickly escalated into a full assault as her stepmother accused Eleanor of deliberately manipulating Alexander through false displays of piety and learning, of trapping a desperate man who could not hope for better given his disfigurement, of calculating with mercenary precision how to escape her proper fate in the church by presenting herself as something she was not and could never truly be. Eleanor stood with her back straight and her hands clasped before her as she had learned to do during 24 years of similar attacks. But something had shifted inside her during the past month of walking beside Alexander and talking with him about matters of substance and meaning, and she found that the old resignation had been replaced by a burning anger that made her voice steady rather than trembling when she finally spoke, to say that she had never claimed to be anything but exactly what she was, and that if Alexander found value in her company, then perhaps that said more about his discernment than about any deception on her part. Isabella rose from the settee with a rustle of expensive silk, and declared with tears of rage in her blue eyes that she had tried everything to capture the Marquess's attention during his first visit, had worn her most becoming gowns and displayed her accomplishments at the pianoforte, and made intelligent conversation about topics she thought might interest him. But he had looked past her as though she were invisible, and had instead fixed his attention on plain, dull Eleanor, who had nothing to offer except a false appearance of quiet dignity that would surely crumble once he discovered how truly unremarkable she was beneath the surface. Lady Catherine seized on this revelation and said that it was unnatural for a man of Alexander's rank and consequence to prefer Eleanor over Isabella unless there was some explanation beyond simple attraction, and she suggested with a curl of her thin lips that perhaps Eleanor had information about the Marquess's debts, or secrets that she was using to force his interest, or perhaps she had thrown herself at him with such desperate obviousness that his pity had been mistaken for regard. The insult about her appearance that finally broke through Eleanor's composure came when Isabella said with deliberate cruelty that at least when Eleanor was shut away in the convent, no one would have to look at her plain face and shapeless figure anymore, and that it was a kindness to the world that she had been destined for a life behind walls where her lack of beauty would not offend those blessed with more pleasing features. And Eleanor felt her carefully maintained control shatter as she turned to her half-sister and said in a voice that shook with suppressed emotion that beauty of face meant nothing when it masked such ugliness of spirit. Baron Thomas entered the drawing-room at that moment and made a weak attempt to calm the situation by saying that everyone should retire for the evening and discuss matters more reasonably in the morning. But his intervention came too late, and with too little conviction to undo the damage that had been done, or to erase the words that now hung in the air like poison. The morning of January 21st, 1818 arrived cold and clear, with frost coating every surface in delicate crystalline patterns, and Eleanor rose at 7 o'clock from a sleepless night to find that the confrontation of the previous evening had settled something fundamental inside her, burning away the last remnants of the resignation that had characterized her entire existence until Alexander Ravenscroft had walked through the door of Ashworth Hall 5 weeks earlier and looked at her as though she were someone worth seeing. She dressed carefully in her dark blue wool dress with the white collar, and took particular care with her hair, pinning it simply but neatly in a style that emphasized rather than concealed her face. And when she looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, she saw not the plain, unremarkable creature that Lady Catherine and Isabella had always insisted she was, but rather a woman of 24 years who possessed intelligence and dignity, and a capacity for genuine feeling that was worth far more than conventional beauty or accomplished manners. At 9 o'clock she walked downstairs with her shoulders straight and her head held high, and when she entered the breakfast room to find Lady Catherine and Isabella already seated with identical expressions of cold satisfaction on their faces, she felt no fear or shame, but only a calm certainty about what she needed to do next. Baron Thomas looked up from his plate with red-rimmed eyes that suggested he had slept no better than Eleanor herself, and when he opened his mouth to speak, she forestalled him by saying in a clear, steady voice that she wished to be taken to Ravenscroft Hall immediately, as she had matters of importance to discuss with the Marquess of Winterbourne that could not wait for his next scheduled visit. Lady Catherine dropped her teacup with a clatter and declared that Eleanor would do no such thing. That an unmarried woman did not present herself at a gentleman's home regardless of the circumstances, and that such brazen behavior would destroy what little reputation Eleanor possessed, and ruin any possibility of the advantageous arrangement that Baron Thomas had been foolish enough to allow. Eleanor turned to her stepmother with a composure that surprised even herself, and said that she no longer required permission or approval from anyone in this house, that she had spent 24 years being invisible and dismissed, and told that her only value lay in removing herself from sight, but that she had discovered in recent weeks that at least one person in the world saw her clearly and valued what he saw. And she would not allow fear or propriety or the poisonous opinions of those who had never shown her kindness to prevent her from claiming the life that had unexpectedly been offered to her. Isabella rose from her chair with her pretty face flushed and her voice shaking as she said that Eleanor was making a terrible mistake, that the Marquis would tire of her novelty once he realized how truly dull she was. But Eleanor felt no anger toward her half-sister now, only a distant pity for someone whose beauty had taught her that appearance was the only currency of value, and who would spend her entire life terrified of losing the one asset she believed she possessed. Baron Thomas stood slowly and reached for his coat hanging by the door, and though his face was haggard with shame and exhaustion, he met Eleanor's eyes and said quietly that he would have the carriage brought around within the hour and would accompany her to Ravenscroft Hall, because whatever his failures as a father had been, he would not fail in this final act of delivering her to the man who had somehow recognized the worth that Thomas himself had been too blind and too selfish to see. The carriage ride to Ravenscroft Hall took 40 minutes across countryside, transformed by January frost into a landscape of crystalline white and pale grey, and Eleanor sat beside her father in silence as the wheels crunched over frozen ground, and her breath formed small clouds in the cold air of the unheated interior, feeling with each passing minute a growing sense of certainty about the decision she had made, and the life she was choosing to claim, rather than simply accepting whatever fate others deemed appropriate for someone of her unremarkable appearance and limited prospects. Baron Thomas attempted twice to speak during the journey, opening his mouth and then closing it again, as though the weight of his shame and regret made words impossible, and Eleanor felt a complicated mixture of anger and pity toward this man who had fathered her but never truly seen her, who had loved her mother but married Lady Catherine within a year of her death, who had allowed his second wife to create a hierarchy in their home where Isabella was treasured and Eleanor was merely tolerated as an inconvenient reminder of his first marriage and a financial burden he could not afford to settle with an adequate dowry. Ravenscroft Hall appeared through the bare winter trees at 10:30 as an imposing structure of grey stone with tall windows that reflected the pale morning sun, and Eleanor felt her heart accelerate as the carriage rolled up the curved drive and came to a stop before the main entrance, where a servant in dark livery stood ready to receive unexpected visitors with the polished efficiency that characterized a well-run household. Mrs. Martha Sinclair appeared in the doorway as Eleanor descended from the carriage with her father following behind, and the housekeeper's weathered face showed surprise, followed quickly by concern as she took in Eleanor's pale countenance and the determined set of her shoulders, saying that the Marquis was in his study attending to correspondence, but that she would announce them immediately if the matter was urgent. Eleanor heard herself say in a voice that sounded steadier than she felt that, yes, the matter was quite urgent, and she would be grateful if Mrs. Sinclair could inform Lord Winterbourne that Miss Ashworth requested a private audience at his earliest convenience, and she saw something shift in the older woman's expression, a softening around the eyes that suggested understanding or perhaps approval of whatever bold action had brought Eleanor to this house without invitation or prior arrangement. The walk through the entrance hall and down the corridor toward Alexander's study seemed both impossibly long and far too short, and Eleanor was acutely aware of the sound of her own footsteps on polished marble floors, of the way morning light fell through tall windows to create patterns of brightness and shadow, of her father's labored breathing behind her as he struggled with the knowledge that he was delivering his daughter to a fate he had arranged but could not control, and of the fact that in mere moments she would be face to face with the man who had somehow seen past her plainness to something he valued enough to offer marriage and security in exchange for companionship and understanding. Mrs. Sinclair knocked twice upon the heavy oak door of Alexander's study, and then opened it without waiting for response, announcing in a quiet but firm voice that Miss Eleanor Ashworth and Baron Thomas Ashworth had arrived and requested an immediate audience with his lordship, and Eleanor saw Alexander rise from behind a massive desk covered with papers and correspondence, his expression shifting from surprise to concern and then to something else entirely, something warmer and more intense that made her breath catch in her throat as she stepped into the room past the housekeeper, who withdrew and closed the door behind them with a soft, decisive click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Alexander moved around the desk with the slight stiffness that always marked his movements on cold mornings, the legacy of old injuries that went deeper than the visible scars on his face and neck, and Eleanor was struck, as she always was, by the sheer physical presence of him, the way he seemed to fill whatever space he occupied, not through size alone, but through an intensity of focus and purpose that made everything else fade into insignificance. Baron Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly and began to speak about the early hour and the presumption of arriving unannounced, but Alexander raised one hand to forestall him while his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor's face, with an expression that suggested he was reading every thought and feeling written there. And after a long moment, he said in that low, measured voice that always sent a peculiar warmth through her chest, that he believed the Baron's presence, while appreciated, was perhaps not strictly necessary for whatever conversation was about to occur, and that if Thomas Ashworth would be so good as to wait in the morning room, Mrs. Sinclair would see to his comfort, while the Marquess and Miss Ashworth discussed certain matters of a private nature. Eleanor saw her father's face flush with a mixture of relief and shame as he nodded and retreated from the study with the haste of a man escaping judgment. And then she was alone with Alexander in the book-lined room, with winter sunlight falling through tall windows to illuminate the dust motes that danced in the air between them. And she realized that her heart was beating so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it in the quiet that had settled over the space like a held breath. Alexander gestured toward the chairs arranged before the fireplace, where a low fire burned with steady warmth, but Eleanor remained standing near the door with her hands clasped tightly together and her spine straight as she tried to find the words for what had brought her here with such urgency and determination, tried to articulate the realization that had crystallized during the long, sleepless night and the terrible confrontation that had preceded it, the understanding that she had spent her entire life waiting for permission to exist, and that she was done waiting, done accepting whatever crumbs of regard others deemed sufficient for someone of her limited worth and unremarkable attributes. Alexander took a single step toward her, and then stopped as though recognizing that she needed the distance, needed the space to say whatever had brought her to his door at this unexpected hour. And when he spoke, his voice was gentle, but threaded with an undercurrent of something fierce and protective that made tears suddenly sting at the back of Eleanor's eyes as he asked what had happened and who he needed to answer to for putting that particular expression on her face that suggested both hurt and fury in equal measure. Eleanor felt the words rising in her throat like a tide that had been held back for far too long, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, despite the tremor she felt running through her entire body, as she said that nothing and no one had put any expression on her face except herself and her own realization that she had lived 24 years waiting for others to decide what her life should be. First, her father, who had planned her retreat to the convent, not out of respect for any calling she possessed, but simply to avoid the expense and inconvenience of finding her a husband. Then Alexander himself, who had arrived with his offer and his terms as though she were a property to be negotiated for, rather than a woman with thoughts and desires of her own. And she was done with all of it, done with being acted upon rather than acting, done with accepting whatever others deemed appropriate for someone of her unremarkable face and limited prospects. She saw Alexander's expression shift as she spoke, saw something that might have been pain or recognition, or perhaps both, cross his scarred features as he took another careful step toward her and opened his mouth to respond. But Eleanor held up one hand to forestall him because she was not finished, not nearly finished with what she had come here to say in the cold light of this January morning, with her father waiting in another room and her entire future balanced on whatever happened in the next few minutes. She told him that Lady Catherine had said terrible things the previous evening, had accused her of manipulation and scheming, had suggested that no man of Alexander's rank and fortune would look twice at someone like Eleanor unless she had employed some form of deception or taken advantage of his isolation and his scars to make herself seem more appealing than she truly was. And Isabella had laughed her bright, cruel laugh and agreed that it was quite remarkable, really, how Eleanor had managed to capture the attention of a Marquess when she had never attracted the notice of any man in the county during all the years of her youth. Eleanor saw Alexander's hands curl into fists at his sides and watched the muscle in his jaw tighten as she continued, explaining that she had listened to these accusations and insults with the same resigned patience she had employed for years whenever her stepmother or half-sister chose to remind her of her place in the household hierarchy, but that something had broken inside her during that confrontation. Some final thread of acceptance that had been holding her in place had simply snapped, and she had realized with perfect clarity that she could not and would not enter into any arrangement or courtship or marriage based on other people's decisions and judgments about what she deserved or what she should accept. Alexander said her name then, just that single word spoken with such gentleness that it nearly undid her composure entirely. But Eleanor shook her head and pressed forward because if she stopped now, she would lose her courage and everything she had come here to say would remain unspoken between them, like all the other truths she had swallowed over the years. She told him that she had come to Ravenscroft Hall this morning not because her father had brought her, but because she had demanded he do so, and she had come to tell Alexander that if there was to be any courtship or any future between them, it would be because she chose it freely and completely, not because her father needed his debts cleared, or because Alexander wanted companionship, or because society expected her to be grateful for any attention from any man, regardless of the circumstances. Eleanor watched Alexander's expression transform as she spoke the final words of her declaration, watched the tension in his jaw soften, and something like wonder cross his scarred features as he closed the remaining distance between them in 2 long strides and then stopped himself again, as though the habit of restraint was too deeply ingrained to abandon even in this moment of raw honesty between them. He said her name again, and this time there was a question in it. A request for permission that made her heart ache, because he was asking rather than assuming, waiting rather than taking. And she realized that for all his initial cold calculation and businesslike negotiation with her father, Alexander Ravenscroft was perhaps the first person in her entire life who had truly seen her as something other than an inconvenience to be managed or a burden to be disposed of with as little expense as possible. Alexander told her in that low, measured voice that had become so familiar to her over the past weeks that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had allowed his own bitterness and isolation to make him forget that other people were not pieces to be moved about on some strategic board, and that when Lord Pembroke had suggested he needed to rejoin society and find a wife, he had approached the prospect with all the warmth and sentiment of a military campaign, identifying what he wanted and moving to secure it with cold efficiency rather than any consideration for the actual human being at the center of his planning. Eleanor felt tears stinging at her eyes as Alexander continued, his voice rough, with an emotion she had never heard from him before, as he explained that he had come to Yorkshire because Pembroke had mentioned in passing that Baron Ashworth had a daughter who was destined for the church, and something about that detail had caught his attention because he thought a woman who had chosen religious life might be willing to enter into a practical arrangement with a scarred recluse, might not expect romance or passion, but would settle for security and respect. And he had told himself it was a reasonable plan that would suit them both without any of the messy complications of courtship or the risk of rejection based on his disfigurement. Alexander's hands were shaking slightly as he spoke, and Eleanor could see the shame and regret written plainly on his face as he told her that he had arrived at Ashworth House with every intention of making his cold transaction, but that the moment he had seen her standing in the entrance hall with winter sunlight turning her hair to amber and her chin raised with quiet dignity despite the dismissive way her stepmother was ordering her about, something had shifted inside him. Some long frozen part of his heart had cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of possibility. He confessed that every conversation they had shared over the past weeks, every moment in the chapel and the library, and walking through the winter gardens, had deepened his regard for her until it was no longer about practical arrangements or military strategy, but about the simple undeniable fact that Eleanor Ashworth was the most remarkable person he had ever encountered, and the thought of her entering into any agreement with him out of duty or lack of options rather than genuine choice made him want to tear up the papers he had presented to her father and walk away from Ashworth House entirely rather than be the next person in a long line of people who had failed to value her as she deserved. Eleanor heard the words leave Alexander's lips and felt something inside her chest crack open like ice breaking under the weight of spring sunshine. And she understood in that moment that what she had interpreted as cold calculation had been a damaged man's desperate attempt to protect himself from further pain, and what she had seen as transactional negotiation had been the only way he knew to reach for something he wanted, without risking the kind of rejection he had faced since the day he returned from Waterloo with his face forever marked by fire and violence. She took a step toward him, then another, watching his grey eyes widen slightly, as though he had not expected her to move closer rather than turn away. And when she was near enough to see the individual scars that traced their path along his jaw and down his neck, she reached up slowly and deliberately and placed her hand against the damaged side of his face with a gentleness that made him close his eyes, as though the touch caused him physical pain. Eleanor told him in a voice that trembled only slightly that she had not chosen him out of gratitude or lack of options, had not agreed to this courtship because her father needed his debts cleared, or because society told her she should be thankful for any man's attention, regardless of the circumstances that brought him to her door. But rather because in the few short weeks since his arrival at Ashworth House, she had discovered in his company a quality of attention and respect that she had never experienced in all her 24 years of being overlooked and dismissed and treated as though her thoughts and feelings were of no consequence to anyone. She felt Alexander's hand come up to cover hers, where it rested against his scarred cheek, felt the tremor that ran through his fingers as he held her palm against his face, as though she were offering him something precious and fragile that might shatter if he did not handle it with the utmost care. And she continued speaking even though tears were now streaming down her own cheeks, because she needed him to understand that what she felt was not pity or compassion for a wounded soldier, but genuine regard for the man he had revealed himself to be in those quiet conversations in the chapel and the library, and walking through winter gardens where the world narrowed to just the two of them and the words they exchanged. Eleanor explained that she had spent her entire life being told in countless subtle and not so subtle ways that she was too plain and too quiet and too serious to expect any of the things that other women took for granted. That her father had decided her fate without ever asking what she wanted, because he had assumed that someone like her would have no dreams or desires beyond whatever practical arrangement could be made with the least possible expense and inconvenience, and that Lady Catherine and Isabella had reinforced this message daily with their casual cruelty and their obvious belief that Eleanor should be grateful simply to have a roof over her head and food on her plate, even if it meant accepting whatever scraps of dignity they chose to leave her. She told Alexander that when she had learned of his arrangement with her father, her first response had been rage, not because she objected to him specifically, but because it had seemed like yet another instance of her life being decided by others who never thought to ask what she herself might want, but that his offer of courtship, with the freedom to refuse at the end, had given her something she had never possessed before, which was the power to choose her own future based on her own feelings rather than other people's expectations or judgments. Alexander opened his eyes then, and Eleanor saw such naked vulnerability in his expression that it took her breath away, saw the hope and fear warring in his gaze as he searched her face for some sign of whether what she was saying meant what he desperately wanted it to mean. And she smiled through her tears and told him that if he was asking whether she wanted to continue their courtship, not because her father's debts required it, but because she genuinely wished to know him better and discover whether the connection they had begun to build might grow into something deeper and more lasting, then her answer was yes, absolutely and completely yes. Alexander held Eleanor's hand against his scarred face for a long moment that seemed to exist outside of time itself, and then he slowly lowered both their hands together until they were clasped between them at chest height, his fingers intertwined with hers in a way that felt both incredibly intimate and perfectly natural, as though they had been holding hands just like this for years rather than minutes. He told her in a voice rough with emotion that he needed her to understand one more thing before they moved forward, that there was a part of this story he had not yet shared, because it made him feel foolish and sentimental in a way that sat uneasily with the cold, calculating reputation he had built around himself like protective armor since returning from war. Eleanor waited in silence, her thumb brushing gently across his knuckles in a gesture of encouragement that made his breath catch. And after a moment, Alexander explained that when Lord Pembroke had first mentioned Baron Ashworth's daughter who was destined for the church, something about the phrase had struck him because Pembroke had said it with such casual dismissiveness, as though it were perfectly obvious that any woman who had not secured a husband by age 24 had no other option but to disappear into religious life, where her failure to be beautiful or charming or whatever arbitrary qualities society valued could no longer embarrass her family. Alexander said he had found himself irrationally angry on behalf of this unknown woman, this person he had never met, whose entire future was being decided based on her supposed inadequacy. And that anger had mixed with his own bitterness about being judged and dismissed based on his scars, until he had convinced himself that perhaps two people who society had written off as unsuitable might find some kind of companionship together, some mutual understanding born of shared experience with being found wanting by the world's harsh standards. Eleanor felt fresh tears prickling at her eyes as Alexander continued, his grey gaze never leaving her face as he told her that he had arrived at Ashworth House, half expecting to find exactly what Pembroke's casual cruelty had suggested, a plain, desperate woman who would accept any offer simply to escape the humiliation of being unwanted. But instead he had found her standing in the winter sunlight, with her chin raised and her hands steady, as she received orders from a stepmother who treated her like a servant, and he had seen in that moment not resignation or desperation, but a kind of quiet dignity that had stopped his breath in his chest. Alexander admitted that every assumption he had made shattered in that first instant of seeing her, that when their eyes met across the entrance hall, he had felt something shift inside him that he could not name or explain, and that every conversation they had shared since then had only deepened his certainty that Eleanor Ashworth was not some convenient solution to his loneliness, but rather the most extraordinary person he had ever encountered. Someone whose worth had nothing whatsoever to do with whether society acknowledged it, and everything to do with the depth of her character and the strength of her spirit. He told her that he understood now how deeply he had wronged her by approaching her father with his calculated offer before ever speaking to her directly, how his own damage and fear had led him to treat what should have been a matter of the heart as though it were a military objective or business transaction, and that if she chose to continue their courtship, he would spend however long it took proving to her that what he felt was genuine regard, and not simply relief at finding someone willing to overlook his scars. Eleanor felt her heart expanding in her chest as Alexander spoke, sir, felt the last remnants of her anger and hurt dissolving in the face of his obvious sincerity and vulnerability, and she realized that what they were building together was something entirely new for both of them, a connection based not on what society told them they should want, but on what they had discovered in each other during those quiet conversations, where pretense and performance fell away to reveal the truth of who they actually were beneath all the labels and judgments that had been imposed upon them.